planted date probably is the strongest non-chemical tool in spring crops that you have. Planted date will have a large effect on BYDV pressure in a mild year. If it's not a mild year and there's not a lot of BYDV pressure anyway, it won't matter so much. But in a mild year, there'll be big differences with planting date.
Given rising costs and increasingly tight margins, it's essential to achieve the highest possible yields from every crop. Spring cereals are vulnerable to aphids and consequently BYDV infection. However, not all crops face the same level of risk, so careful management is needed to avoid unnecessary insecticide applications. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. There has been a significant amount of research in recent years aimed at improving BYDV control and maximising yield. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Louise McNamara, a researcher with Teagasc, to discuss aphids, BYDV, but also bean weevils. Louise, you might first explain what BYDV is and why it continues to be such a concern in spring barley.
So BYDV is barley yellow dwarf virus. So it's a plant virus spread by cereal aphids when they feed on the crop, but it's actually multiple different virus strains together that are causing a disease called yellow dwarf virus. And we're concerned about it in all cereals, really, all cereal crops, really, not just barley. What really makes it important in any given crop is when it's planted. So if it's planted early in the winter or late in spring, that's when you get the most aphid activity, and that's when your crop is most at risk.
Okay, so look, it's obviously an important, I suppose, infection point for spring barley. In terms of, the other crops, the spring barley, is that affected more so than spring oats or spring wheat?
So what really decides how much a crop is affected by BYDV is really when it's planted. So oats and wheat are probably planted earlier than barley, so they're going to be protected a bit more by the fact that aphids get active as you move into the spring summer. So if you're planting March or earlier, it's a little bit colder generally and aphids are not as active. But then when you move into later March, April, temperatures generally warm up and aphids get more active. So really what decides if a crop is at risk is the aphid activity, which is linked heavily with temperature.
And I suppose what we know is it probably tends to be that little bit colder the further north you go, maybe up to the growers up in Donegal, but maybe that little bit warmer further south, maybe growers around Kinsale. Is it as specific as that there's certain areas that are, I suppose, maybe going to get more BYDV because of that aphid activity than others?
BYDV kind of naturally will vary a lot by year and also by location. So by year, it'll vary a lot depending on the temperature throughout the year and the previous year. And then by location, so general location, so if you're near the coast, you might get a milder winters, less frost. So in that case, that suits aphids if there's no or little frost. So those kind of locations would be a higher risk. And then on a field level, there's all different real risk factors that field will have, like surrounding landscape, green bridge, all those kind of things. So there's an awful lot of factors at play where we can't say that this part of the country is definitely going to get more than this part of the country. It's a mixture of the temperature in any given year. And if you're near the coast, yes, you'll probably have milder weather, so you'll probably have more aphids. And then each field has its own individual risk factor as well.
The winter gone out, I suppose, wasn't as cold. We didn't have too much cold weather in it, but over the last few days, or certainly around me at least anyways, there's been a number of frosts every morning. Is that likely to kill any aphids, like any aphids that kind of went over the winter time? And will that kill any of those aphids over the last number of weeks? Does it hinder their reproduction and I suppose infection of some of the crops out there?
So cold weather will certainly slow them down. So, if it's colder or if you have frost, they're not going to be moving around as much. They're not going to be reproducing as much. They're not going to be spreading virus then. But then when it warms up, as long as they're haven't died from the frost, you need, depending on the aphid species, they all have different levels of sensitivity to frost, but you need a good bit of frost probably really to kill them. So if they're inactive when it's cold, when it warms back up again, they'll become active again and start reproducing to start spreading virus.
Okay, so these nice days where you only have maybe a frost of 0 or -1 and the daytime temperature goes up to 15, or I think toward the end of the week towards maybe 20 degrees, that's not really going to do aphids any harm necessarily.
Yeah, it depends on the species, but generally, you're not going to clean up the crop or anything. But they're not going to be active when it is cold, but when it's mild, they'll be active again.
There certainly has been a move, Louise, over the last 5 or 6 years where, I think for the most part, a lot of farmers, if they can manage not to put on an insecticide, they will try to do that as much as they can. They're very people are maybe more and more conscious, I suppose, of the environment out there and all the beneficials that might be out there. In terms of the non-chemical strategies to try and reduce BYDV, what are the big things that a spring grower should look out for?
So I suppose plant to date probably is the strongest non-chemical tool in spring crops that you have. So plant to date will have a large effect on BYDV pressure in a mild year. If it's not a mild year and there's not a lot of BYDV pressure anyway, it won't matter so much. But in a mild year, there'll be big differences with planting date. What's difficult for spring crops is you don't have the variety choices that are now available in winter crops. In winter crops, you have your tolerant varieties that you can help with planting date to reduce your need for insecticides. But in spring barley, we don't have that yet or in the immediate future.
Okay, so the earliest, I suppose, Louise, in terms of the planting, very little done in February, small little bit done in I suppose early March, but mostly it's been later March. So you now have the earliest sown crops coming to the ground or 1 to 2 leaf stage at this stage. What are the risk of those, I suppose, in a general sense? Like, are they medium, low, or high?
It's hard to say because, as we were saying, BYDV really varies by year and by site. But generally speaking, from the previous work by Tom Kennedy and Teagasc, and also from our own work, say if you're looking at planting in kind of mid-March versus mid-April, you're talking about maybe mid-March being low to medium in a mild year. So maybe something like you could have 1%, maybe up to like 6%. In a mid-March zone, and then you could see something from like you could even see up to 20% in a mid-April zone. So there's big differences there. So mid-March generally would be considered low up to medium, and then mid-April medium up to high risk, because every field has its own individual risk as well.
So a bit of history, I suppose, there in terms of what the farmer would see year on year is probably not a bad thing either to put
Yeah, and
into that
then
mix as
like
well.
if they're seeing, if they walk the crop, are they seeing aphids or what's their winter barley maybe that's nearby looking like, that kind of thing as well.
So, in terms of then, there probably are some fears because I know you came out with this a number of years ago, and people are more conscious of the resistance issues around the insecticides that we use. And I suppose, in a general sense, there's lots of names out there, but we tend to use just a one type of insecticide, being pyrethroids. How important is that resistance out there in terms of using that type of insecticide?
So I suppose when first we think about resistance, it's only one of the three main cereal aphids. So there's three main species: the grain aphid, the rose grain aphid, and the bird cherry aphid that are all spreading BYDV and winter and spring barley. But it's just the grain aphid that has resistance detected in Ireland to date, and in the UK as well. So the grain aphid is our most important vector, but it is only one of three. So in your field at any given time, you might have more than one species, and only one species has resistance. And then the level or the percentage of aphids with resistance in that field will vary as well. So that could be, depend on the field, maybe 0, maybe 20, maybe 50. So you're still killing a proportion of the grain aphids and then the other aphids as well. And then for the resistance one, so far we've detected partial resistance, which means it only has one copy of the gene, which means you're still killing also a proportion of the aphids with resistance. So you are still killing or controlling a certain number of the vectors. And our trials to date have shown that the pyrethroids still are given generally quite good control in particularly in winter crops. We see it very easily. So pyrethroids are still working in general. Of course, it depends on the field. If a particular farmer has a very high level of resistance, they may get a spray failure.
Okay, and in that type of scenario, there's no point in obviously going back with a pyrethroid again because that's really not going to do any good at all. But is there any other insecticide classes out there that a farmer can rely on in those circumstances?
So there's carnadine is another insecticide that's available at the moment, acetamiprid, but for spring barley, it's from growth stage 30 onwards. So that probably isn't really going to do a lot for BYW control in spring barley just based on the growing date, because growth stage 30, kind of after growth stage 30, 31, you don't see, you will get virus, and you get virus the whole way through the growing season. But after that stage, the crop is hardier, so it's unlikely to have, that serious yield loss. So we don't really recommend spraying after growth stage 30, 31 anyway, because the real yield limiting infection has already occurred. So really for spring cereals, for controlling BYDV in spring cereals specifically, really the pyrethroids is the only one that has the use at the right growth stage around growth stage 14.
If that's the kind of the main one that farmers should really be thinking about, is there any way that a grower can reduce the amount or slow down the amount of resistance development that they have in their crops?
Well, I suppose the two things. One is the planting date. If you're planting earlier, you're reducing your need for insecticide in the first place. And secondly, if you try only spraying once, because the researchers showed that a single spray at growth stage 14 or around then, it gives the best impact on yield. We have to remember we're not trying to keep the crop clean of aphids, because that's not possible. In mild weather, like, they're going to be arriving all the time. So we're not trying to make our crop completely clean, completely free yellow leaves. We're trying to target the most serious infection, which is that early infection around then. So don't repeatedly put out sprays to try and clean up the crop, because it won't work. And also that's where resistance can develop. So also, if you think that your insecticide failed and you're seeing aphids after you spray, it's best not to follow up, as you said already, Michael, with the same spray, because that also can exacerbate resistance.
So it's one well-timed aphicide at what, leaf 3, leaf 4, somewhere around there. That's the best you can do.
Around there. It's tricky with spring barley, obviously, growing quite fast. So just kind of around that time.
You did mention it earlier, Louise, around resistant or tolerant varieties. I know that there's certainly a number of them in the winter barley scene. Anything that you know of coming through in the spring barley side of the house?
And not anything I know of coming in the next number of years for spring barley, no. But hopefully in the future that will be a tool as well, because it's obviously already and going to be even more so, and a very important tool in the winter crops.
So, Louise, then apart from spring barley, there's a lot of beans out there this year, and people can often get a problem, or certainly notice bean weevils out there. You might describe to me what's the life cycle of that like, and what sort of damage that can cause in beans.
Yeah, so for the pea and bean weevil, its migration occurs kind of early in spring. So what you're looking for is periods of time where you have the maximum air temperature is above 15 degrees. So a number of days above 15 degrees. The weevils will start coming out for their overwintering sites, which is kind of like field margins and on kind of grassy areas around fields. And they'll start to move out and move into the crop then. And then they will start feeding on the crop. But it's generally not the adults feeding that does the most damage. It's the eggs they lay in the roots, those larvae hatch, and they start feeding on the root nodules. And that's really where you get the most significant damage. And when the crop is most at risk is when it's smallest and most susceptible to damage. That's why winter beans are normally advanced enough when they're emerging that it doesn't do major damage to them. So when your spring crop is recently emerged, it's most susceptible to damage. And their life cycle is one generation per year. So it's one kind of period of them migrating into the crop, feeding, laying eggs, those eggs hatching, turning into larvae, those larvae feeding on the roots, and those adults then moving off again to wintering sites.
So what does a strategy for control look like, and when should a farmer start thinking about that?
So I suppose the first thing to do is, if a grower is concerned, is maybe monitoring. So you can buy kind of trapping kits to help you monitor, that have lures in them that help to attract the adults from the overwintering sites into the trap, so you can kind of know if you have pressure on your site. You can also look out for notching on leaves as well, or near to the margins. And it's important to kind of do that early, because the early crop is the most at risk. So if you're going to treat, you'd need to treat very early to try and interrupt egg laying in the crop and reducing that damage to the roots. There is thresholds if you're trapping. So for those using traps with the lures, the thresholds for spring beans would be around 30 aphids on any given day. And that matters if the crop is about to emerge or been emerged for the next 10 days, basically, because that's when it's most susceptible in its first 10 days, 2 weeks of emergence. And then you would spray then if you reach that threshold. And there's a number of sprays available for use against bean weevils in bean crops. And then the one thing to bear in mind for treating and spraying is that in the UK, there has been resistance found in bean weevils to pyrethroids. That's not yet been detected in Ireland, but we will keep an eye on that. So again, like with pyrethroids or any insecticides like we talked about in spring barley, it's important to use them as minimum that we need to use them, and not to do too many follow-up sprays to help prevent resistance developing or spreading.
So Louise, the very final question, I just happened to be in a crop of beans over the weekend and I just noticed this. You might describe the differences between what weevil damage looks like and what slug damage looks like.
No problem. So the weevil damage will look like U-shaped notching on the leaves, and often it starts close to the edge of the field, close to the hedge where the bean weevils are moving in. And then the slug damage is more throughout the leaf and kind of larger circles of damage as well.
Big clumps of stuff kind of. Okay, Louise, that's brilliant. Thanks very much for that, and thanks for all that information. And look, I might catch up to you later on in the season just to see how maybe some of your research is going. Thanks very much, Louise.
Perfect, thanks.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Louise for joining me on the show. The Teagasc Spring Walks continue next week, starting in Kildalton College in Kilkenny on Monday, followed by an event in the Department of Agriculture site in Ballydown on Tuesday. And on Wednesday we'll be in Drummond's in Termafackin in Louth, and then in Kinsale and Youghal on Thursday. At each event we will be discussing the agronomy of spring crops with particular focus on managing rising costs and tackling wild oat herbicide resistance. Full details are available on the Teagasc website, and you should also receive information from your local advisor in advance. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast and recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.